Hey, Untold Radio Network fans. Want exclusive perks and to support our channel? Introducing our YouTube membership program with 3 amazing levels. Get loyalty badges that level up to different cryptids the longer you're a supporter. How cool is that? You'll also get access to custom Bigfoot emojis and priority in chat. Upgrade to Backstage Pass for exclusive wallpapers, photos, status updates, discounted books, and merchandise. Go all in with the producer level for everything mentioned plus member shoutouts. Ready for an enhanced experience? Join now, pick your membership level, and let's make this journey even more exciting together.
The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold Radio Network. I'm your host, Dean Bertram, and I'm delighted to have you here with me this evening. I'm delighted if you're watching or listening to the show after it goes live on Saturday night, whether it's on YouTube or Facebook or any of our many podcast platforms. It's a cold, rainy night in the Northwoods tonight, so it's a perfect night to talk all things weird, and I couldn't have a guest I'm more excited to have on the show. I've been meaning to get him on for it seems like years now, and I finally have him here. He's a documentary filmmaker, an adventurer, an avid outdoorsman, constantly searching for the unknown. Traveling across North America and the world, he has looked into various cryptozoological creatures like Sasquatch, the Loch Ness Monster, the Lake Champlain Monster, mystery big cats, as well as other Fortean phenomena and mysterious places like the Bridgewater Triangle, and he's done many documentaries on these topics and more. He's chronicled over 50 Bigfoot sightings in his home state of New Hampshire. He's a Small Town Monsters crew member and has searched far and wide for Sasquatch in the Bigfoot Beyond the Trail documentary series on YouTube, which has amassed over 12 million collective views on that platform. That's just incredible. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to the show Aleksandar Petakov.
Hey, Dean. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate the awesome intro there as well.
Well, man, it's a great delight to have you here on the show.
Yeah, it's a cold, rainy night here as well in the Northwoods of New Hampshire. So we're in a similar kind of geographical zone, so to speak. So I think it's fitting, as you mentioned, to talk about a lot of this stuff.
Perfect. Perfect time to chat about it. And before we get back in, because I don't know that much about your history. I mean, I've been following your work since you've done things for Small Town Monsters that we'll get into. But I'd like to find out a little bit more about your background. But before we do, tell us about your latest project, because I'm up to episode 2 now of Dark Coast, and then it starts to get rainy and foggy and misty. So it might be a perfect time to jump into Dark Coast.
Yeah, that title I think fits really well with the way that the visuals of that series kind of came out. So that is called Dark Coast, Hunt for the Alaskan Bigfoot. I just kind of call it Dark Coast. It's easier. It rolls off the tongue a little better. Mm-hmm. But it's a continuation of a previous 2-part documentary that I did last year called The Alaskan Coastal Sasquatch, which was part of the Bigfoot Beyond the Trail series. And that was covering a property in Alaska that I visited last year with Eli Watson, other investigators as well. I know you said you've spoken with Eli before, so he was involved with that. And then so Dark Coast was a return to that same location just a year later. We knew we wanted to return. It was really an interesting area. I can talk more about kind of the specifics of it as being a cabin basically built in the middle of nowhere on Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. It's over an hour boat ride from the nearest town. And it's really in the middle of nowhere, steeped in these prehistoric-looking temperate rainforests. It's part of that rainforest chain that you have that goes from Alaska all the way down to basically Northern California. So all that kind of Pacific Northwest, classic Bigfoot sort of habitat. with these giant mountains that just roll up into the ocean and glaciers, and really interesting area, lots of great wildlife. So Dark Coast is just a series that's kind of documenting my 2-week stay there at that property and kind of the investigations we did. And it's if you like boots on the ground stuff, it's very heavy in that. It's not like some of the Beyond the Trails that I do, or some of the other STM documentaries that are very interview heavy, where you're talking to eyewitnesses, you're talking to other researchers. This is strictly just my personal investigation. So some people might not like that because it can be kind of dry if it doesn't have a lot of action or a lot of, oh, what was that kind of stuff. It's sort of more just, this is what we did, and it's almost like a video journal, I kind of call it, of our time during that period. So each episode covers a number of days, and we had, I think, 10 days of rain while we were out there. So it was like, just pummeled us. So it was pretty wild. So we chose the name Dark Coast previous to that, and because the time we went last year, it was sunny almost the entire time, which is very unusual for a temperate rainforest. Almost a week long of great weather. So this time we got dealt, the opposite hand, I suppose, and it fit very well with the title Dark Coast, because it was, some of those drone shots and some of the footage there going through the fog is some of the most visually amazing stuff I've ever had the chance to capture. So I think it fits really well.
I'm quite conscious when I watch a lot of your work that not only do you have a fantastic job looking for Bigfoot and cryptids and all these things all around the country, but just the other wildlife you see. Like in this location, there's whales and there's seals and there's eagles, and it's just, I think one of the interviewees is trying to describe the vastness of it, and he's like, you can't even put this into words. It's such a spectacular location.
Yeah, that's just one of the perks. I've always been an animal person and a wilderness person, so being able to just interact with those environments is obviously incredible. Alaska is in a class of its own. I don't think there's any denying that. But the thing about it is, what I love sharing that with people, because I think a lot of times you watch some of these Sasquatch films, or just people when they do their research, they're focusing so hard on just maybe what they're doing on hand. They don't take a chance to actually show the viewers or help illustrate, well, this is what the environment is that you're in. This may be a place that you may not be completely familiar with. So you want to showcase, well, this is some of the plant species here. You've got devil's club everywhere. You've got all this moss, all this kind of stuff that would exist. I live on the East Coast in the Northeast in these kind of mostly pine and kind of temperate forest here. So they're not very similar to the rainforest that you'd have in those areas of Alaska, deciduous tree cover. So for me, it's always interesting to be in that environment. Maybe if you're from Alaska, it might not be that exotic, but showcasing the environment is a huge part of what I consciously try to do in some of my work, just because you do have these things where you get woken up at 8 a.m. after staying up till 5 a.m. the night before because the guys are seeing a whale right outside in the bay, right outside the cabin. So it's like, oh, time to get out there, time to go look for it. So you never know in a place like that what you're going to see. But the thing about Alaska that I think is even perhaps different than a lot of places that are still remote in the lower 48 or parts of Canada is that Alaska is truly still the domain of all those creatures that are out there. It's not like you go to a national park or maybe a national forest in California or West Virginia, where there still is wildlife, there's still that remnant of wilderness. Alaska, it's the other way around. It's like humans are the little outposts out there, right? You have a town here or a cabin here. Everything else is controlled by Mother Nature. There's no freeways, nothing to divide up some of those natural habitats. So it's completely different, I think, than a lot of the other places in the lower 48 and parts of Canada, certainly.
I've really enjoyed a lot of the small town monster work lately that has looked at Alaska, and we were talking a little bit about the show as well, Land of the Missing, or the Small Town Monsters documentary Land of the Missing, which you feature in. And thank you for the super sticker, Nancy Malcolm. We really appreciate it. Which kind of, I suppose, there is something about Alaska, as you're talking about the size of it and the mysterious disappearances, which people are probably familiar with paranormal programming, like, Missing in Alaska have heard about before. But it has an extraordinary number of disappearing people, and one of those reasons might be just because the landscape can kill you, as I think one of the Small Town Monsters documentaries makes fairly clear. but in an interview there. But do you suspect that there's something behind the people going missing in Alaska, which is attached to Sasquatch or to some other anomalous or paranormal or unexplainable or unexplained phenomenon?
Possibly. That's really the only answer I can kind of give. I don't know with certainty, of course. As you mentioned, the thing about Alaska is that it is so brutal to human beings. I mean, especially if you're not prepared. Even people that are extremely experienced, big game hunters that are going out there hunting grizzly bears that will kill you and eat you, they can end up in these situations where they just twist an ankle, fall into a ditch. Sorry, game over kind of thing. There's no mercy in a place like that. I mean, when we were up there, just seeing all the different climates between going there last year and then I spent a month up there this summer, the interior of Alaska, where it's hot in the summer and you have an ungodly amount of mosquitoes that just attack you at any moment, unlike anywhere I've been. And then you drive 6-7 hours south and you're in these coastal rainforests where it's 50 degrees for a week straight. It's such a juxtaposition in that place. So even during the summertime, I mean, winter up there is obviously brutal. I think largely, I'd say probably a majority of people who do go missing in Alaska is natural causes or human stupidity. I used to hike and backpack quite a bit here in the Northeast, and I saw more than my fair share of human stupidity, which is basically the number one cause of rescues, search and rescue situations in mountainous areas. People go up and they just are not prepared for, getting hailstorms in the middle of summer, which is something that can happen. I think that's a majority of cases, stupidity, unpreparedness, but obviously wildlife, those kinds of things, just external factors. But when it really kind of gets down to it, you do have some of those stranger disappearances. Now, also partially a place like Alaska, being that it is at the end of the road, so to speak, literally. I mean, there's a highway up there that I drove in Homer, Alaska, that's the westernmost part of the freeway attached to the rest of the highway that you could get to any other part of the United States through Canada, literally the end of the road. But figuratively, it's the end of the road in the sense that a lot of strange people go up there. They don't necessarily, maybe they have a shady background, shady past. They don't want to be found. So where's a good place to go? Somewhere like Alaska, right? You go up there, you can kind of disappear. So there's a lot of actually crime and really strange stuff that is involved with that kind of human stuff, but also with the daylight. In the summertime, it doesn't really get dark. In the wintertime, it doesn't really get light. That drives people delirious. I mean, that is a really, that can be a serious problem up there. So I think there's a lot of mental health stuff. But then you're left with kind of a small percentage of cases that are just really weird that I don't think we can even begin to try to understand. I mean, there's a lot of UFO stuff in Alaska, of course, and that's a big topic around the world, of course. But there are a few of these cases that some of them were covered in that Land of the Missing film that just seem really weird and hard to explain. And for me personally, I think Sasquatch being some sort of creature or something that inhabits the land, whether it's flesh and blood or not, I don't know. But whatever it is, I imagine it would probably be capable of harming a human being if need be. I mean, there are these stories that a lot of the indigenous cultures throughout the U.S. and Canada talk about the cannibals that steal your children. I mean, I spent a week with the Newhalk Nation First Nations group in British Columbia, Canada, and their folklore of the Sninnik, which is a Sasquatch-like creature, talks about it stealing children and putting it in a basket to carry around and eat the children in their cave. So there are these kinds of stories, obviously folkloric in nature, but all you need is one of these instances to take place, and that maybe gets rolled into some mythology, or maybe you have just kind of different interpretations of people going missing. Oh, they died over there. We don't know what happened to them. We have no way of verifying it, so maybe we're going to blame it on the Nantinak or the hairy man, right? So I don't know. That's the only really way I can try to grasp with it. There's that one story in the Land of the Missing that talked about a boy who went missing. I don't remember which part of Alaska, and it's in the film. But he went missing, and they found, I guess, where they believed he had built a little fire, and there were these kind of large footprints around it. So they assumed that maybe this Sasquatch, or whatever it was, took the child. That's hard to say, of course, but I found that one to be pretty intriguing. The guy who told the story apparently was pretty adamant about that's what he heard while he was living in that area. So I want to say I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's the main cause, of course. I mean, I think there's a lot that that's to be determined in that category. It's not as easy as saying yes or no. There's a lot of nuances, and I think you need to take in each individual case and kind of look at it.
Yeah, that's interesting. There's a comment here from Uncle Bones which leads into something I was going to ask you, and I'll jump to it now instead of later in the interview when I was going to chat about it. And he says, yet Bigfoot is seen near neighborhoods. And I think his point is that we think about Alaska, and one of your crew members in Dark Coast makes that point, that when he's looking at the terrain, he's like, well, if Bigfoot's going to be anywhere, this is the kind of place he's going to be, right? And it makes a lot of sense. Well, it makes more sense to me that there could be some kind of relic population of something in the Pacific Northwest or in Alaska or in some of these incredibly large tracts of land. But as Uncle Bones just mentioned, it is weird because Bigfoot also gets seen in the outskirts of cities and in neighborhoods. What's your take on that? Do you think there's Bigfoot might be more than one phenomena? Like, I know my co-host on Mysterious Library, Jason McLean, suggests that maybe there is a genuine physical sample of Bigfoot, which is very small, and then maybe these things that appear in cities might be something else altogether. They might be something paranormal. But other people suggest they travel, the country. They have kind of, they migrate or such. Do you have a take on why these things are seen outside cities as well in these more obvious wilderness regions?
Yeah, it's a good question. Definitely interesting. I mean, I think when it comes to those kinds of sightings, well, first of all, we need a person to have a sighting, right? You need the ingredients. So if you're in a totally remote area, I mean, there can be no known sightings in the area, but it's a plenty of good habitat, right?
Good point.
I mean, here in my state of New Hampshire, it's the second most forested state in the U.S. after neighboring Maine. So we're surrounded by millions of acres of wilderness in New York and Quebec, Canada. And the sightings tend to come from the more, I should say, densely populated counties. So, like where I live, it's rural, but there's houses and there's rural neighborhoods. So you may drive a minute up the road to get to your neighbor, as opposed to northern New Hampshire on the Canadian border, where there's literally more moose than humans. There's actually more sightings in an area like this than there is up there because there's just more people around to see it. And when it comes to sightings near cities, I mean, the only ones that I'm really familiar with are, even in Alaska, there's sightings just on the outskirts. I mean, there'll be a valley like in Hatcher Pass, Alaska, which is just north of Wasilla, which is kind of right north of Anchorage. Very human kind of inhabited area. A lot of people go up there dirt biking, ATVing, fishing, mining, really close to the city. Yet there's a lot of sightings in that area. Way more than there are in some super remote areas like where we were at Area A with that cabin. So I don't know if it's just because these things are maybe coming closer. What I've noticed though with stuff like the Bigfoot Mapping Project, and obviously you can talk about the BFRO, other databases throughout time where you get kind of an aggregation of sightings, which is really cool to start plotting those on maps. If you have accurate locations of where well, this is the general area where it happened, start to plot them. And they line up a lot with byways that animals use, with corridors that have been set up for wildlife. It's really interesting. You don't get like random sightings in small patches of woods in Brooklyn, in big urban areas, which I would think if it was something that was some kind of paranormal aspect to it, it could appear anywhere, right? You'd imagine, well, if people are seeing it at this rate in the Rocky Mountains, in the wilderness areas, why are there no sightings in Denver? I mean, that's what I have trouble kind of wrapping my head around. But yeah, there are sightings in some of these more suburban kind of areas, but I find that a lot of sightings that I've looked at tend to be actually towards towns or towards the edge of towns, especially in areas that border these wilderness areas, where you have other wildlife that are regularly coming in, whether it be bears or moose. I mean, places like Alaska, right? They get moose in downtown Anchorage just wandering right around. I mean, there haven't been any Bigfoots that I know of in Anchorage wandering around. There have been, stories and stuff like that, but a lot of stories you got to take with a grain of salt. But for example, one sighting that comes to mind to me is one that we got to look at that was actually reported quite a number of years ago, just a few years ago actually, down in Florida. We were in the western part of the Everglades. This was back in January. And the Everglades is almost 3 million acres of protected land, larger than the state of Rhode Island. And that's where you have a lot of these skunk ape sightings. You also have black bears out there. You have obviously alligators, crocodiles, invasive pythons, and a population of Florida panthers, which is something I'm keenly interested as well, given the whole mystery big cat kind of connection. But this guy had lived essentially in a new condominium unit that was put up right at the edge of this state forest that connects into national preserve land, and there's skunk ape sightings on both sides of this preserve, essentially, none in the middle, because there aren't really people going into some of these deep areas. But he had talked about, living in this area, we've seen Florida panthers, we've seen bears, we've seen alligators, we've seen manatees in the water, everything right in our area. And he says one night he's hearing this strange sploshing kind of smacking sound on the pavement. It was after rain, I believe, and he sees what he can only describe as this ape-like creature run under the streetlight, heading back up towards this kind of state forest area, the Picayune Strand Forest. Actually, it's in that area. It's a really interesting sighting because this guy's used to seeing all these other animals. He's thinking maybe he's seeing a bear or something else, yet he's seeing what he can only describe as an ape-like creature, which I just find really interesting. And his home and that, probably multi-million-dollar condominiums there, right with a marina, it's in Florida, set up basically right next to all this land, and people see animals regularly there. So it's interesting that he also saw this creature he could not describe. So I don't think it's that unusual or surprising for maybe juveniles or younger ones to maybe venture into towns. I mean, I have no way of basing that in really anything except for anecdotal stories over the years, but I don't know. I mean, there could be multiple things going on. I don't know. I mean, I don't discount the paranormal kind of side of it. I've been told reports. They're a minority for sure. I mean, less than maybe 5 to 10% is stories that include weirder aspects. Now, some will argue, well, maybe some people don't want to talk about, the weirder side because they think, they're already telling you they saw an 8-foot-tall ape man. Maybe if they tell you the weird stuff, you'll think they're crazy. I'm like, well, you're already telling me you saw a Bigfoot. So, I mean, believe me, I've heard it all. Go right ahead, And I've seen a UFO. I've had a weird UFO experience. So I know there's weird stuff out there. But if I saw a Bigfoot in the woods and then an orb after it, would I assume that they're connected? Well, what if I saw a deer run through the woods and then I saw an orb after it? Would I also assume they're connected just because the two things were strange? Are they connected? Whereas if you see a deer and then an orb, you're probably not going to make the assumption that they're connected, but they could be. I mean, I'm not saying they're not. As I mentioned, I think there are other weird things out there. UFOs and all this other kind of stuff we just don't really understand. Obviously, that's a huge topic now with this government involvement and whatever's going on with that. But there could be multiple things going on. I mean, things mimicking Bigfoot. I mean, you don't know. It's strange out there. Unfortunately, I think with some of the stranger stories, I will say I think there's a little bit more room for conjecture. That's what I think is interesting. Whereas with Bigfoot sightings, let's say you get 20 Bigfoot sightings, and very credible, Class A. You're able to examine the character of the witness and all the kind of criteria that's involved in vetting that sort of sighting. You can say, okay, well, these two people, let's say one is in Oregon and one is in West Virginia, they're describing the same exact behavior. And maybe those are even pre-internet stories. So there's not very much room for external influence. They're describing the same thing. Whereas I think maybe when some of the more paranormal side of it gets into it, there's nothing to compare it to. So I don't know if we necessarily don't know where to place it or how to kind of categorize it other than general high strangeness, which could really include anything at this point. Whereas if you're, and I'm not saying you should look at it in a certain sort of frame of mind, but keep an open mind, of course. That's what I kind of try to do. I know there's been certain groups in the past that have cherry-picked the data, so to speak. If a certain detail doesn't necessarily fit their kind of hypothesis, they'll exclude that. That's obviously not right. I mean, but just because they are a minority doesn't mean that I'm going to assume that is something I need to look for, right? So that's just the kind of way I look at it, if that makes sense. I probably, it's hard to kind of convey all that, but that is the way I kind of try to look at it, at least.
No, I get it. I think too, I know that you and Small Town Monsters have both looked at window area type places like Chestnut Ridge, Bridgewater Triangle. There's obviously places like Skinwalker Ranch. There's
right.
Mothman territory back in the day. The Point Pleasant area was somewhere like that. And John Keel talked about these things, who popularized Mothman, as being window areas where there seem to be multiple, what appear to be different phenomenon, but perhaps they're all source of, perhaps of these different phenomena are all actually the source of one phenomenon. But what's your take on window areas where you get these multiple, as you mentioned, high strangeness accounts, or all these different type of anomalous experiences or cryptids or paranormal phenomena, which we normally think of as separate, but they all seem to focus in on these specific areas.
You know, it's really weird. I don't know. I used to think the idea of window area was kind of silly and like, oh, you know, whatever. This is kind of stupid. But my opinion has slightly changed based off of that UFO experience I mentioned I had in an area of Pennsylvania. We kind of dubbed the Pennsylvania Triangle. It's not the Chestnut Ridge. It was an area that's kind of near DuBois, Pennsylvania. So it's kind of central part of Pennsylvania. There's a lot of weird general stuff in Pennsylvania, but this area would be northeast of the Chestnut Ridge. And that was an area where I was invited on by some colleagues, a guy named Paul Eno of a show called Behind the Paranormal. He had invited me out there a number of years ago. It was kind of a case he was working. He thought, oh, there's a lot of weird, interesting stuff going on here. People are talking about UFO sightings. There was also talk of Bigfoot, so of course that kind of piqued my interest. Pennsylvania is a great place, I think, for a lot of Bigfoot sightings. Has some of the highest amount of registered hunters in the U.S., so you've got plenty of people out in the woods to see these kinds of things, and I think it's now in the top 10 for reported sightings in the U.S., so, you know, Pennsylvania is kind of a no-brainer. And I went out there 2 years in a row. The first year, I was definitely more focused on the Bigfoot stuff, and it was that second year back in 2019 when I went that we saw this kind of, and I can only describe it as a UFO, so unidentified flying object. I mean, it could be secret government technology, of course. Nothing I've ever seen, and my grandfather was a pilot. I've grown up flying. I've flown drones for a number of years, so I haven't seen anything like that. And even at the time, a friend of mine who was the chief video analyst for MUFON was perplexed by the footage we got of this object, and it was kind of floating through the sky like a leaf in slow motion. It looked like an illuminated cloud, and it was kind of just moving through the air, and we saw these little orbs or balls of light shoot out of it, fly around it, and back into it. And so our minds were blown, right? And some of the guys I was with were more into the UFO topic. I really wasn't. I mean, even though I grew up in New Hampshire, which is obviously famous for the Betty and Barney Hill story, right? I never really, I was always more into Bigfoot and the cryptid side of things. So that was really interesting. It was weird, and we've got it on footage as well. It's on my website, on my blog section. If you go back to 2019, you can find it on there, and we have the footage on there. It's filmed with like a night vision camera. That kind of opened my mind a little bit. And so we would have these town hall meetings when we go to this community there, and just we would stay with a local family, and they would basically round up their family and friends and come tell us all their weird stories. And we were like, oh man, we've got this crazy UFO story to tell you guys, and we told them, and they were kind of like, yeah, that kind of stuff happens pretty commonly around here. It's almost like it wasn't a big deal, right? So we're like, okay, I guess we're not special at all. This is pretty normal. And they told us all kinds of stories. There were some Bigfoot stories, of course. I got to do a lot of the Bigfoot interviews. There was, like school children talking about, yeah, we've seen black helicopters just fly over here. Just weird stuff. So I don't know what's going on. But that definitely opened my mind a little bit more to the other strangeness. Of course, you mentioned the Bridgewater Triangle. I'm just a few hours north from that area of Massachusetts, coined by Lauren Coleman back in the day, and just a hotbed of high strangeness of all kinds. I mean, it's a really twisted area because you have real monsters there. When I say real monsters, I mean humans committing horrific murders and crimes that, we interviewed the former detective of the Freetown police. Freetown State Forest is considered to be one of the most haunted forests in the U.S., and this detective, he told us stories that while interviewing him, you could have heard a pin drop. We're all, ghostly white, listening to him telling stories about, newborn babies being murdered in the woods. I won't even get into some of it. It was really, it was some heinous stuff, right? And this is an area that has a history of kind of weird cult activity. It was involved in the Satanic Panic back in the 80s. So there's real monsters there, and by real monsters I mean human beings committing horrific violence against each other. And it's an area where you've also got stories of pukwudgies and weird spook lights. And it's like, I don't know if it has to do with energy, just extreme negative, horrific energy. The only time, and I've heard stories about people, and I'm not really into ghosts or anything like that, but I've heard stories of people going to battlefields, going to Gettysburg or going to Auschwitz. The only time I ever had a really strange reaction to being in a place that was connected with strange kind of death was this place in the Czech Republic, actually. So my family's originally from the Balkans, Serbia, and that kind of region of Southeast Europe. So I grew up having the chance to go over there a little bit to visit my extended family, and I went to the Czech Republic at one point, not that far away, right? And I went to this place called the Bone Church, Kutna Hora in Czech, and it's crazy. It's a little kind of chapel built by this supposedly blind monk and his followers after the Black Plague, where they used the bones and remains of various people who died from the bubonic plague and assembled chandeliers, and the walls are covered, and there's skull mounds in there. And I went in there and physically got sick. And I'm not squeamish. I've seen a lot of messed up dead animals in the woods and stuff like that. So I'm not really one to get I don't get grossed out by blood. I've had plenty of times where I've busted myself out and bleeding in the woods, so this was just something so, you could just, the energy was tangible, how awful it felt. I had to physically leave. I felt just sick to my stomach and just like this really weight on my shoulders almost of some kind of that was the only time I've really ever felt something like that. So I don't know if energy has something to do with it. A place like the Bridgewater Triangle had a history of horrific warfare between the Plymouth colony, the settlers, and the Wampanoag First Nation that lived in that area. Yeah, it was considered to be one of the bloodiest wars at the time in the Americas. So there's just a long history of negativity in that area, and even people talk about some of the researchers I know, people like John Horrigan and Christopher Balzano, others who were involved more in the Bridgewater Triangle research, talk about there being more of a case of psychiatric and mental health issues in that part of southeast Massachusetts than in many other parts of the country. So I don't know. I mean, it's really strange. So I have no clue where to begin with window areas, but in a place like Bridgewater Triangle, you have, in my opinion, pretty interesting, incredible Bigfoot encounters that took place in the 60s that, maybe that's, let's say, flesh and blood, because I think a lot of the sightings now that are taking place, there's a lot of conjecture, because a place like the Bridgewater Triangle is one of the most famous, triangle areas other than the Bermuda Triangle. So people go out there just to have fun, So they'll go in the woods, and any noise they hear will become, oh, that was a pukwudgie, or that was a Bigfoot, right? So the mind takes over. So I think the pre-internet stuff, when there was no name for the triangle, really was very interesting. And one of the most interesting Bigfoot stories in that area, I'll share quickly, was one of this. There were these kind of a rash of Bigfoot sightings in that area in the 60s towards a place called the Hockomock Swamp, which the Wampanoag tribe considered to be sort of a cursed area. They called it the place where spirits dwell. I mean, it's a place you go in there, you get ticks, all kinds of just gross swamp. I mean, it's a swamp. You don't want to be there in the summertime. So they kind of kept out of it. But there's a lot of Bigfoot sightings that have originated from that area, as well as other weird stories. But in the 60s, there were some strange sightings going on, and the local police were involved in the towns of Bridgewater, I think West Bridgewater. And one night, a officer was kind of on patrol outside of a property where a woman had her chicken stolen at one point, and he describes, all of a sudden he feels the back of his cruiser being lifted up. And he looks, kind of puts the brake light on, and the red glow of the lights could see like a hairy torso, kind of chest, and it literally lifts the cruiser up and drops it.
Wow.
And he gets a spotlight out and sees this thing run off, and he kind of described it as like weird bear on two legs, right? I mean, because how do you describe something like that? But he did believe it was some kind of Bigfoot creature, and was so interesting about that story is that my friend Paulino actually physically interviewed and talked to him at one point. So, and he swears by that story. John Horrigan, another researcher friend of mine who did a lot of work with that Bridgewater Triangle area, talked about it as well. He had talked to people who interviewed this man and said he was adamant about the story. And then there was a documentary done about it called The Bridgewater Triangle, done by Aaron Cadieux. It's a fantastic film. It's free on YouTube. Go check it out. It covers every single topic I've mentioned about the Bridgewater Triangle in a much better way than I'm describing it. But he said when they were premiering that film at one of their showings there in the New England area, the daughter of that officer came to the premiere, and this was after he had passed away, and said, I'm the daughter of that police officer. He absolutely believed that happened to him. He did not think it was strange or a joke. He thought it was, what happened to him actually happened. So it's, there's not a lot of animals that can lift a police cruiser. I mean, if you look especially in the 60s, some kind of a pretty hefty vehicle, right? So, I mean, a black bear doing that, that's the largest animal you would have had in that part of Massachusetts at the time. And since then, since the 60s, those areas have become increasingly more cut off from possible wilderness areas, and the greenways have been cut into. So I think that affects a little bit maybe of the frequency of the sightings, and I don't think that area is really suitable habitat for something that would be flesh and blood. Now, if it's not, then obviously the rules change, but that's just what's so interesting about the Bridgewater Triangle and areas like it. So yeah, it's you have so much going on, it's almost kind of hard to keep track of it all.
Oh, indeed. And thank you to Patricia Younger-Coker for the super sticker. We very much appreciate it. Now, I know you're an avid outdoorsman, Alex. What came first, your interest in the outdoors or your interest in cryptozoology and Bigfoot, or did they come up at the same time? Or what happened, the chicken or the egg? Which way did it go?
It's a good question. I don't really know, actually. I want to say probably the love of the outdoors. I was actually born in South Africa, believe it or not. My parents, they left their country of Yugoslavia when the Civil War started there in the 90s. So I ended up in South Africa, and I spent my first few years there. I don't remember much, but I mean, that's a country where you're just outside all the time. I mean, even you have verandas, and your house is partially outside. It's very much a pleasant climate year round. So that's kind of how I think I got my start with fascination with wildlife as well. I mean, hearing all these stories about my parents encountering elephants and having baboons on a roof at night. We lived in an area that was about, I think, 2 hours north of Johannesburg, near the city of formerly called Petersburg, now called Polokwane. It was my birth city. But yeah, so I think that's kind of where that came from. But I know the mystery stuff started pretty quickly after that. I moved to the United States when I was a kid. So this was the 90s, right? You had stuff like the X-Files and Animal X, all this, obviously the In Searchos, all that old stuff. At the time, in the 90s, the Patterson-Gimlin film site was not officially known. That wasn't rediscovered until later by the Bluff Creek Project. So there was a lot of these documentaries of people trying to find where the Patterson-Gimlin film site was, right? 30 years later, nobody knew. So I think the two passions kind of converged, and later in life, I got into filmmaking as well, and just continued with the outdoor stuff, and I've done a lot of hiking and backpacking, and just tried to merge, I guess, those three things. And I think that's some of that is pretty evident in some of the work I do, just trying to kind of combine it all, I suppose.
And which is going to lead me into a question which I'm going to kind of steal and change from Henry E. White Jr. He asked, what do I do if a Bigfoot gets shot around me? But I'm going to spin that because we're running out of time. One thing I really respect and I notice about you is you're always armed when you're out in these wilderness areas, which of course makes total sense to anybody who lives in rural America. But often you see these shows and they're out in the middle of nowhere, and you're thinking, is maybe the cameraman's got the gun in case like a bear or a puma? I mean, this doesn't make any sense to me. But so this is a question which I often ask Bigfoot folk, but I think it's a specifically significant question to ask you, because obviously you're armed, and I'm assuming you're well trained in how to use them and the like. Why do you think there's not so few, but why don't we have any body yet? Just in the perspective of somebody who shot one, I know in Land of the Missing, one of the witnesses on there swears he shot one and hit it a few times. And throughout the literature, there are so many stories of Bigfoot being shot at and either it not reacting or it limping off or it just swatting the bullets like flies. There's so many stories I've read over the years. What's your take on why in America, which is a land of firearms, God bless the Second Amendment, I'm always armed, as probably almost every second person in my neck of rural America, why hasn't anybody shot one yet? Just it comes out, you know what I mean, and you're scared. And it isn't that people haven't shot at them, because we hear that happening again and again and again.
Right.
So I would assume there'd be a body from one of these encounters.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting story. I don't know. There's obviously stories, a lot. I mean, most of what we have in this topic is stories. I mean, one interesting story that comes to mind for me is one that occurred actually not in the United States, but it was in Russia, and I believe in the Caucasus or somewhere in kind of Russian mountain range in some of those former Soviet republics. It was during the Russian Civil War in the 1920s, and there was, I think it's just a dispute of if it was the Red Army or the White Army, as you had two of these kind of opposing factions fighting for control of Russia. And I believe it was the Red Army looking for holdouts of the White Army after kind of the Bolsheviks had won, and they came across this cave and they thought, well, there must be, some rebels hiding in there, and this hairy creature comes running out of it, screaming at them, and they end up shooting it and killing it, and they buried its body with stones, right, and just kind of left it there. That's just a story, but it's interesting because those regions of the Caucasus and Russia, there's a lot of these sort of Denisovans and these kinds of near human kind of creatures or ape-like creatures that have been found, or fossil remains have been found, so to speak. But when it comes to North America, it's a really good question. I think personally, just in general with Bigfoot, I don't think there's a lot of people really, truly, meaningfully searching. A vast majority of the encounters are completely coincidental. People were driving and it crossed the road. A hunter was in a stand and he happened to see it. I've heard stories where they're looking at it with the scope and they think, well, I don't want to shoot it, right? I don't know what it is. It could be a person, right? Then obviously you're looking at a manslaughter kind of situation. But there are those stories. I mean, you've got stories. The Justin Smejas story is one of them, right? Whatever happened there's a story. There's also one that I think I brought up to you when you guys were doing the Land of the Missing show about this story that I was told as well in West Virginia from the family that runs the West Virginia Bigfoot Museum, of a big hunter who came in one day and says, oh, you don't really believe in this kind of Bigfoot crap, right? I said, well, we do. We have a museum about it. Obviously, we kind of do. And he just starts bawling his eyes out and crying, saying, well, I shot and killed one of these things, and a larger one came out and took its body away. But again, that's just a story, right? That you can either you can believe it or not, but there's nothing substantive about that, right? We can't verify this guy's story because he has nothing to show for it. So I really don't know. I mean, I would imagine at some point we'd have something. So maybe that is something more in the paranormal side of things that's kind of a plus in that direction. But I do think because of the remoteness of some of the terrain that's out there, vast majority of sightings being people that are not wholly prepared at all for what they're about to see. Many of them, snowmobiling or just a random activity and having even PTSD as a result. I don't think they would have been in the right state of mind to maybe shoot something. I could be wrong. Obviously, there are stories of people shooting it. So there's, that's just something we have to contend with. But for all the investigators out there, for all the researchers, the majority are kind of weekend warrior types. And I'm not putting myself in a category of real researcher. I mean, I only really do it when I'm out there and on my own. That's kind of, I'm not, part of some elite kind of group or anything. But there are groups, I think, that are great, like the NAWAC or the Olympic Project, but they're so few and far between, right? Most people are weekend warrior types. They get out, they're on their own budget. So, and there's very few groups, even within the Bigfoot topic, that are pro-kill, right? Most are anti-kill. And it's even actually, a lot of people get offended. You want to suggest trying to shoot or kill something. So, no, I don't think there's a lot of good answers for that. I'm not going to sit around and make excuses for why there isn't one when we probably should have one by now. But maybe that just speaks to the nature of how elusive they are, how uncommon they might be. Despite the kind of amount of sightings that are out there and seemingly increasing, but there may be other factors for that as well. As the topic of Bigfoot grows and people, as we know, can be unreliable in certain situations, so maybe interpreting what they want to see. I don't know. It's really interesting.
I mean, it's certainly elusive, as is almost everything in the cryptozoological or the Fortean or the paranormal or anomalous fields. And speaking about it being elusive, I cheekily titled this episode "Filming Bigfoot" because much like finding Bigfoot, it's pretty hard to do, right? So,
yeah.
what have you kind of learned in all these years of doing it now? What hints would you give to somebody, or what do you do yourself when you're out there and you're trying to maybe capture something on film?
I mean, being prepared, I think, is just the key. There's been so many times where you see an animal and not even be able to get it on film because as much as you say you're prepared, you're not prepared. I mean, I've had a bull moose run out for maybe 15 feet from my car, and by the time I have my phone and camera ready, he's already in the woods and I can't even see him anymore. And this is a 1,000-pound animal that's 6 feet 6 to 8 feet wide with its antlers, right? So it's unbelievable how quick some of these kind of situations can be. And most of these Sasquatch sightings, seem to be kind of a fleeting glimpse, very quick. Person, again, maybe it was just completely caught off guard. So I don't know. I mean, is it a game of a chance? Most of these good encounters, again, they're happening randomly. I would say most of the suspicious activity we've had happen has been random when we're not expecting it, right? We're just hanging around camp and we hear a whoop, or we're just sitting around a fire and suddenly we start hearing what sounds like rocks being thrown, and then wood knocks when we're not at all expecting it. So I don't know if you can really predict or prepare for these things. Other than hopefully, if we look at something like the Patterson-Gimlin film, if it is legitimate, which obviously is a question still to this point, or other pieces of footage out there, these people were either really lucky or they were just prepared and they happened to go through that moment with luck and they had the right gear with them at the time. So that's kind of the philosophy I like to look at, is to be prepared, because you have all these people with all these stories. Well, I had my camera in my hands, but I didn't pick it up. Or I had it in my backpack. That's going to be useless in that moment. So I don't know. I guess being prepared in that and hoping that moment comes across. But I don't know. I think it's almost like if we're comparing it to another primate, I'm not saying I think Sasquatch is like a gorilla or a chimp. It's obviously, even if you look at just the foot morphology, it would be different in a different category, I'd assume, than chimps and gorillas and orangutans with that divergent big toe, which is used for climbing. Sasquatch, in appearance, looks more human, but I'll leave that to people like Dr. Jeff Meldrum and others who know way more about that and actually have degrees to cover. But if we compare kind of some of the behavior, I think that's a little bit interesting. That a lot of these people talk about researching chimps and gorillas and other non-human primates, and it's almost like they were the ones to initiate contact. So the person is just waiting to kind of be let in. Diane Fossey, Jane Goodall, they talk about, well, it would take us weeks before we even heard one, and then months before we actually even saw one. It's almost as if they were getting more comfortable. So maybe there's a similar situation here. I don't know. But again, it seems like majority of those encounters are either random or people are hanging around at camp just doing normal stuff, and then something weird happens. They'll hear a wood knock, and then they see something walk through the trees. I mean, that's, some of the sightings kind of are analogous to that sort of thing. So I don't know if I can really impart much wisdom. I think I probably have more questions after this or throughout this journey than I did beforehand, which is often the case with this topic, especially when you have such a broad focus. I mean, going across the United States. But the one thing that's just been so interesting is just the consistency in some of the reports, the consistency of behaviors and habitat and the requirements. And I look at one area I typically look at is, can this habitat support moose, right? It's a 1,200 plus pound animal that consumes a lot of vegetation, needs a lot of water. If a habitat can support moose, I'd say it probably has at least some kind of biological metrics to perhaps support something like a Sasquatch. That's something I typically look at. So those would be more northern areas. Obviously, you don't have moose in a place like Florida for skunk ape, but there's other things you can look at. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just oftentimes this topic just kind of leads you down different rabbit holes, and you end up where you end up. But then you start reading about vocalizations, and you hyper focus in one area for a little bit, and then you neglect another. So it's I don't know how to really kind of sum up my thoughts after doing this now for a few years. It's a strange topic for sure.
It sure is. One of the things I'm most interested about with your research going forward is something you uncovered when you were on the Alaska coast. And I think it first appeared, I can't remember now because I've watched them all, but I think you might have first got it in the Alaska coastal Sasquatch parts 1 and or 2 of Bigfoot Beyond the Trail, but certainly you were in the same cabin in Dark Coast. And that's right. The handprint that you pulled off the cabin, which is kind of this aluminum siding type cabin, or at least that's what it looks like. And in the documentary, I know you say that you sent it to Doug Hychek, who is the person who is the founder and brains behind Untold Radio Network, and of course also the creator of Monster Quest. And you mentioned in there he's going to be looking at it in his upcoming documentary Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 2. Now, I don't know if you can give us any inside goss, because I don't have any, or if that's something which is still a secret and being unveiled later, or if it's still being examined. Do you have any more you can tell us about that print? Or
yeah, I mean, all I know is that we submitted it then. Yeah, we sent it. We had Larry Beans Baxter, who's a great researcher up there in Alaska, former police officer, retired. So he was perfect to be able to collect that kind of stuff. Any kind of, like he was examining a crime scene, right? He's bringing that skill set that he has to a Bigfoot investigation. At least from what I know from recent updates is that sample that we had from the handprint is among some of the samples being tested for legend meat signs too. I don't. It's not complete yet, at least to my knowledge. But that's the most recent update as of like a few weeks ago that I know of. And hopefully, I'm not stepping on anybody's toes by saying that. But I know it's kind of part of the process. So that was really interesting. Yeah, we just wanted to kind of the property owner there as well was in touch with Doug and was asking, hey, we found this out here totally coincidentally, and it was really weird because. An area like that with the amount of rainfall, and we didn't get any rainfall that period when we found this kind of weird handprint up on the backside of the cabin. It's one of those things where you could clearly see dermal ridges, right? Dermatoglyphics, which is only found in primates, to my knowledge. So a bear or a moose that might live in that area would not be able to make an impression like that. So it's a 50-50 chance, right? Maybe that's a human, of course. That's the most obvious, probably first answer you should look for is that it's probably one of us or somebody who's been, doing some work there around the cabin. That's going to be your first assumption, but you also have a 50-50 chance that it's not, right? So I kind of like those odds. It's a flip of a coin. That was really interesting. It was just totally coincidental, and it kind of, our working theory at least, is that we think that handprint was actually put there before we arrived, because we didn't have any indication anything came really close to us. We had thermal cameras out. We had audio, and we were really kind of monitoring that immediate area, and nobody had really looked behind that cabin. It was a totally coincidental move. I was going there and swapping a battery on an audio recorder when I said, hey, maybe I'll look here, because there have been stories by that window, which is near the bunk room where usually 3 people will sleep in there. And the first summer they were building the cabin, they had a weird incident where that was their entrance into the cabin. It wasn't fully closed off at that point, and something managed to launch a 70-pound Yeti cooler halfway across the cabin, and they thought it was a bear, and they're grabbing shotguns and running over there, and they said they heard what sounded like something bipedal going up the hill. Could that be a bear? Sure, it's possible, right? Of course, but there's just that area is kind of weird. People don't like to sleep in there without the blinds closed because they think something's going to watch them. It's the only way to really look into the cabin, I guess. But the hand positioning was really weird. It looked strange. There was no thumb. We thought it was worthy enough of being documented, so that's what we did, obviously, and that's what we were kind of out there for. So even if it's something totally mundane, well, hey, at least we put the effort into collecting it. So. Our working theory is that was put there before we arrived at the cabin, because there was about a week between the last visit to the cabin and when we showed up, and when the property owner and another person were there before we were out there, they had seen something strange on a thermal that was just kind of like this blob up in the hill and the trees. So we kind of theorized maybe they might come down after a few days when there's been nobody at the cabin. That's why when we were out there, there was one day where Rob Roy Menzies, who was out there with us, had to go home, so he was taken back via boat, so the guys would be gone for a few hours. And myself, Eli, and Ron Reed, who was also in the crew, we played it cool in the cabin. We tried to make it seem like nobody was there, maybe to see if something might come down, but we didn't really have anything substantive. So our working theory was just that, hey, maybe these things, after a few days of no activity, maybe that's when they get a little bold. And there's been points where cameras have been out in those areas and haven't gotten anything, so that's also a factor. But I don't know. That was just a fun one to find, and obviously cool to document.
No, it was fascinating. We've had a number of really cool questions in the chat tonight, and I haven't been able to hit them all, but Mothman46 has asked a couple, so I'll ask one of his.
What's up, Mothman?
Yeah, he's great. Do you think
awesome.
that Bigfoot can see, sense IR, infrared light?
I don't know. Maybe. Certainly I know other animals can. I have trail camera footage here from my own home of deer, moose approaching the camera and messing with it, both at night and in daytime, or stopping in their tracks and looking at it. I have footage of coyotes running up to the camera and then realizing it's on and getting very frightened and just running right away. So they're either hearing it or they're seeing it somehow. Now those animals have that kind of night vision, that they produce that eye shine to beat them, lucid them, I believe. So Primates are not particularly known for their really good eyesight. So if we look at humans and gorillas and other things, we don't have nearly as good as night vision, so to speak, as other animals, ungulates and other mammals, right? But with Sasquatch, we don't know. I mean, there's so many unknowns. Obviously, trail cameras, if we're to look at it statistically, in terms of good Sasquatch evidence, are a failure completely. We don't have really any, what we'd expect, good evidence, video or photo from trail cameras. So I think maybe pattern recognition. Other non-human primates have very good pattern recognition compared to humans. They can out-ace us usually in basic shapes and kind of memory sort of stuff. There's been some experiments done with chimps that can outwhiz a human just because maybe they're more focused on different. They're using their brain power for different reasons, whereas we're using it to file taxes and do totally ridiculous kind of stuff. So stuff that we probably shouldn't be using it for. But yeah, that's certainly a good question. I don't know, but we have to assume maybe there is some kind of connection between sensing IR or staying away from trail cameras. Yeah, I don't know.
Another great question. This comes from Asper60, who actually I believe is Jay Katz, who is the host of another incredible show on the Untold Radio Network, Down South Anomalies, with his wonderful wife Aspasia. And he asks, basically, in terms of filming Bigfoot, I guess, do you think horseback riding can help in terms of keeping your scent off the forest floor and assisting you in the element of surprise?
I mean, I'd certainly like to think so, right? That sounds like an awesome idea in theory. Now, place like the Patterson-Gimlin film site, which right now is actually not doing very well. They're surrounded by forest fires, but it's another story. But back in 1967, allegedly when Roger and Bob rode out that day, right, they were on horseback, and that supposedly might have aided them. Maybe it masked their scent. I don't know. Obviously, horses have their own smell, probably better for wildlife than we are with our synthetic kind of chemical smells and everything that we put on ourselves and our clothing, certain smells, obviously fake chemical kind of smell. Maybe, I mean, we've tried it before in Colorado. We went out to a property out there with a history of activity, and we did some horseback riding just to kind of see, going through some canyons. Well, hey, is this something feasible? I don't know. I mean, the thing that I struggle with is why has nobody else that's been on horseback, well, maybe they're not as prepared, I suppose, with a camera, right? But why have they not had something like this happen since 1967, if we're to assume, again, the Patterson-Gimlin film is authentic? It's a good question. I mean, I'd imagine it probably wouldn't hurt, right? Being on horseback, just having that kind of surprise. You're not going to sound like a human either. You're going to sound more like a four-legged creature. So, yeah, I mean, I'd love to do more experimenting with it, but that's a tough one to arrange, right? If you don't have horses, there's a whole host of difficulties with that.
I know that Doug Heidcheck has recently spent a lot of time developing electric bikes, I think, to try to do trail searching for. And I think that's going to be featured some in the new upcoming documentary, Sasquatch, Legend Meets Science 2, which I'm sure everybody's looking forward to listening.
Yeah,
It's just been a great joy talking to you finally tonight, Alex. Thank you so much for coming on. But how do people get a hold of you and what you're up to now? Just for people who mightn't hear this, there is a link tree of yours, I believe, in the show notes, but maybe you want to suggest some ways they can get a hold of you.
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on, man. It's been awesome. Thank you for listening to my ramblings and my thought process, which can be all over the place. But yeah, a good place to find out would be my website, Petakov Media. That's Petakov media.com. There's links to everything on there, basically. You can also just go to the Small Town Monsters website or YouTube channel and find some of my work on there. But the website has links to that, my blog, all kinds of other stuff on there. So you'll find links to social media, everything on there. So that link tree also works really well. It's got everything kind of aggregated in one place. So that's probably the best.
And when can we expect the next Dark Coast episode to drop?
That's a good question. We have a lot of stuff because we have myself doing Bigfoot Beyond the Trail and Dark Coast. Eli is doing his own series. Seth has his own series. We each kind of get, what's so cool about it is we get to do our own different takes, and it's completely what we want to cover, really. So I think Dark Coast probably at some point in October, if I'm not mistaken, scheduling-wise. I do have a Bigfoot Beyond the Trail episode dropping before the next Dark Coast, which will be about interior Alaska, stories. So going more in the central parts of Alaska, kind of the places you necessarily wouldn't expect Sasquatch to be in, but there's reports from those areas.
Oh, excellent. That's very exciting. And I know Small Town Monsters has a new werewolf documentary dropping in about a week or two. And Jason McLean and I were lucky enough that Seth Breedlove sent us an advanced screener of that. And we will be talking about it this coming Tuesday night on Mysterious Library. So people should listen into that. Again, Alex, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was a great joy talking to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Dean.
Oh, and until I get to talk to you and to everybody else out there, keep it weird.
The paranormal.
Intro. Now the outro.